Nobody expected the funeral to end before the first goodbye was spoken. The cold Ohio wind drifted across the cemetery as dark clouds gathered above the hillside. Dozens of mourners stood quietly beneath black umbrellas, their attention fixed on a polished mahogany casket resting beside a freshly prepared grave. The air carried the scent of wet grass and rain. It was supposed to be a day of mourning, a day for family, a day for a mother to say farewell to her son. At the center of the crowd stood Angela Brooks. Dressed in a simple black dress, she remained motionless beside the casket, her eyes fixed on the framed photograph resting near a bouquet of white lilies. The picture showed her son Marcus smiling beside Lake Erie on a bright summer afternoon. Looking at it now felt almost impossible. 7 days earlier he had been alive. 7 days earlier he had called her just to ask what she wanted for dinner. 7 days earlier she had still believed there would be time for all the conversations they had not yet had. The minister stepped forward and opened his Bible. Family members moved closer together. Marcus's grandmother wiped tears from her cheeks. A little girl clutching a single white flower slowly approached the casket, preparing to place it beside the photograph. Everything felt painfully quiet. Then the sound arrived. At first it was distant, barely noticeable, a faint siren carried by the wind. Several people glanced toward the cemetery entrance before returning their attention to the service. But the sound grew louder and louder. Within seconds, every head turned. 3 police vehicles rolled through the cemetery gates, their flashing lights cutting through the gray afternoon. The minister lowered his Bible. Conversation stopped. The little girl froze where she stood, still holding the flower. Angela slowly lifted her eyes toward the approaching vehicles. A strange feeling settled in her chest. Not fear, not confusion, something deeper, something that told her this moment did not belong here. The vehicles came to a stop less than 50 feet from the gravesite. Doors opened. Uniformed officers stepped out. At their front was Officer Ryan Mitchell. Tall, composed, and moving with the confidence of a man who believed he was carrying out an important responsibility. Rain began to fall in thin drops as he walked directly toward the funeral. Several family members exchanged uneasy looks. One cousin stepped forward. "Officer, what is going on?" Ryan did not answer immediately. His attention remained fixed on Angela. Around them, reporters who had been covering the funeral from a distance suddenly became alert. Cameras lifted. Microphones appeared. The atmosphere shifted from sorrow to tension in a matter of seconds. Angela remained beside her son's casket. She did not move. She did not speak. Ryan stopped a few feet away and removed a document from inside his jacket. The cemetery seemed to hold its breath. Even the rain felt quieter. "Angela Brooks?" he asked. Angela nodded once. "Yes." Ryan glanced down at the paper before looking back up. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." Gasps spread through the crowd. Marcus's grandmother covered her mouth. The little girl looked up in confusion. The minister stared in disbelief. Angela turned her eyes toward the casket, toward her son, toward the goodbye that had barely begun. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then, far beyond the gathering, a black SUV appeared near the cemetery entrance. Its occupants watched the scene unfold with expressions that looked far more worried than surprised. And while nobody standing beside Marcus's grave understood why the police had arrived, those men already knew something that would soon change everything. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The rain continued falling softly across the cemetery, creating tiny circles and puddles forming between rows of headstones. Angela Brooks remained beside her son's casket, her eyes resting on Marcus's photograph. Everything around her seemed distant compared to the grief she had carried since the day she lost him. 1 week earlier, she had been standing in her kitchen preparing dinner. Marcus was supposed to arrive shortly after work. His favorite cornbread was already in the oven. The table had been set for 2. She still remembered checking the clock and smiling when she saw his name appear on her phone. At the time, she had no idea how precious ordinary moments truly were. Since then, every room in her home had become a collection of memories. His coffee mug still sat near the sink. His jacket still hung beside the front door. A photograph of him laughing during a family barbecue still rested on the bookshelf in the living room. Small details that once felt ordinary now felt impossible to replace. Around the cemetery, family members watched Angela carefully. They knew how much Marcus meant to her. After her husband passed away years earlier, Marcus had become the center of her world. Yet he was not only important to her. Looking across the crowd gathered beneath umbrellas, Angela could see how many lives he had touched. Former classmates stood beside elderly neighbors. Young children from the community center stood quietly with their parents. Several local coaches had come. A retired teacher wiped tears from her eyes. Marcus had a gift for making people feel seen. He remembered birthdays. He called relatives just to check on them. He volunteered whenever someone needed help. At 24 years old, he had somehow earned the respect of people twice his age. The minister remained silent near the grave, allowing the family a moment to process what was happening. Marcus's grandmother sat trembling beneath a large umbrella. The little girl holding the white flower looked from Angela to the police officers and back again, unable to understand why a funeral had suddenly become something frightening. Officer Ryan Mitchell shifted his weight and glanced toward the growing number of cameras. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. Yet he forced himself to remain focused on the assignment he believed he had been given for a reason. Earlier that morning, he had reviewed the file several times. The instructions had been clear. The urgency had been emphasized repeatedly. At the station, everything had seemed straightforward. Standing in a cemetery beside a grieving mother felt very different. Across the parking area, the black SUV remained motionless. Two men inside continued watching the scene unfold. One checked his phone repeatedly. The other stared directly at Angela with growing concern. Neither looked surprised by the police presence. They looked worried, deeply worried. Back at the gravesite, Angela finally lifted her eyes toward Ryan. Her voice remained calm despite the pain visible in her face. "Officer," she said softly, "can this wait until my son is buried?" The question drifted through the rain. The crowd fell completely silent. Even the reporters stopped speaking. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire cemetery was waiting for a single answer. Officer Ryan Mitchell held Angela Brooks's gaze for several seconds before answering. Rain tapped steadily against umbrellas as the entire cemetery waited. "I am sorry for your loss," he said carefully, "but I cannot delay this." A ripple of disbelief moved through the crowd. Marcus's grandmother lowered her head. The minister closed his Bible. The little girl holding the white flower stepped back toward her family, confused by the tension surrounding her. Ryan remained focused on Angela. In his mind, this situation was never personal. It was procedure. It was responsibility. It was what he believed the law required. Earlier that morning, he had arrived at the station before sunrise. A file marked urgent had been waiting on his desk. Several reports had been attached. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Certain recommendations came from people higher in the chain of command. By the time he finished reviewing the material, he believed he understood the situation. He believed immediate action was necessary. Most importantly, he believed he was doing the right thing. Throughout his career, Ryan had learned to trust documentation, trust evidence, trust process. That trust had earned him a reputation for reliability. Supervisors respected him because he followed procedure. Fellow officers respected him because he rarely second-guessed assignments. In his experience, hesitation created mistakes. Action prevented them. Yet standing in front of Angela Brooks beside her son's casket felt different from reading a report inside a quiet office. The image in front of him refused to fit neatly into the conclusions he had already formed. He had expected resistance. He had expected arguments. He had expected someone trying to avoid questions. Instead, he found a grieving mother standing in the rain beside the final resting place of her only child. Angela remained remarkably calm. Her hands rested gently in front of her. Her eyes carried exhaustion more than anger. Around them, reporters continued filming. Camera lenses reflected gray clouds and flashing lights. The story was already spreading beyond the cemetery. Ryan knew that. Yet he continued telling himself that public attention could not influence his judgment. The file mattered. The assignment mattered. At least that was what he believed. Nearby, Marcus's grandmother finally spoke. "Please," she whispered, "let her bury her son." The pain in her voice lingered in the cold air. Ryan looked away briefly. He felt the weight of every eye watching him. Still, he remembered the instructions he had received, the urgency that had been emphasized, the expectation that action could not wait. If he walked away now, he feared he would be ignoring a responsibility entrusted to him. Across the parking area, the men inside the black SUV exchanged worried looks. One reached for his phone again and began typing rapidly. The other stared toward the gravesite with increasing concern. Whatever they knew, it was making them nervous. Back near the casket, Angela slowly turned toward Marcus's photograph. Rain droplets clung to the edge of the frame. His smile remained frozen in a happier time. For a brief moment, everything around her seemed to disappear. The police, the cameras, the questions. She remembered Marcus teaching neighborhood children how to fish. She remembered his laugh during family gatherings. She remembered how proud she felt watching him grow into a man respected by everyone who knew him. Then she looked back at Ryan. "You truly believe this cannot wait?" she asked softly. Ryan hesitated for the briefest moment. Then he nodded. "No, ma'am," he replied. "I do not believe it can." The cemetery fell silent again. And at that exact moment, a sharply dressed man carrying a leather briefcase stepped from the black SUV and froze the instant he saw Angela standing beside the casket. The man carrying the leather briefcase moved quickly through the rain, his polished shoes splashing across the wet pavement as he crossed the cemetery grounds. Unlike the reporters who had suddenly become energized by the unfolding scene, his attention was fixed on a single person, Angela Brooks. The moment he saw her standing beside Marcus's casket, concern flashed across his face. Several mourners stepped aside to let him pass. Officer Ryan Mitchell immediately noticed him and narrowed his eyes. Something about the stranger's urgency felt unusual. The man was dressed in an expensive charcoal suit beneath a dark overcoat, the kind often seen in federal buildings and courtrooms. Yet his expression carried none of the confidence normally associated with those places. It looked more like alarm. He stopped a few feet from Angela and removed his glasses. Rainwater clung to the lenses. "Mrs. Brooks," he said quietly. Angela looked at him and gave a small nod. "Daniel." The simple exchange immediately caught Ryan's attention. They clearly knew one another. "Who is this?" Ryan asked. The man turned toward him. "Daniel Whitaker." He reached into his jacket and presented identification. Ryan examined it briefly before handing it back. The title meant little to him at that moment. What mattered more was Daniel's reaction to the situation. He looked as though he had arrived too late to prevent something serious from happening. Around them, cameras continued recording. Reporters whispered to one another. The rain steadily intensified, creating a gray curtain across the cemetery. Marcus's photograph remained beside the casket, partially covered by droplets of water. Daniel glanced toward it and lowered his eyes respectfully before looking back at Angela. "I came as soon as I heard," he said. Angela nodded once. The exhaustion in her face seemed heavier than before. "Thank you." Ryan stepped forward. "If you have information relevant to this matter, you can provide it at the station." Daniel stared at him for several seconds. Not angry, not hostile, simply stunned. "At the station?" he repeated. Ryan folded his arms. "Yes." Daniel slowly looked around the cemetery, at the grieving family, at the unfinished funeral, at the little girl still holding the white flower, at the casket waiting beside the open grave. Then he looked back at Ryan. "You chose this moment?" The question carried no accusation. Somehow that made it even more uncomfortable. Ryan felt irritation rise inside him. "Sir, I am following instructions." Daniel appeared ready to say something more, but stopped himself. Whatever thoughts were running through his mind remained unspoken. Across the parking area, the black SUV remained motionless. One of the men inside lowered his phone and looked toward the cemetery entrance. In the distance, another dark government vehicle had just turned onto the narrow road leading toward the funeral grounds. Its headlights cut through the rain. Back near the gravesite, Marcus's grandmother quietly wept. Family members gathered around her. The little girl tightened her grip on the flower. None of them understood why strangers kept arriving. None of them understood why the funeral seemed to be attracting so much attention. Yet the atmosphere had changed. What began as confusion was becoming something far larger. Angela sensed it too. She glanced toward the approaching vehicle and then back at Daniel. For the first time since arriving, genuine worry crossed his face. The kind of worry that appears when events are moving beyond anyone's control. Moments later, the second vehicle rolled to a stop near the cemetery entrance. The rear door opened. A distinguished man stepped out into the rain. The instant Daniel recognized him, the color seemed to drain from his face. Under his breath, barely loud enough for anyone to hear, he whispered 2 words. "This changes everything." The rain continued falling as the distinguished man from the second vehicle made his way toward the gravesite. Unlike Daniel Whitaker, he did not hurry. Yet something about his presence immediately drew attention. The men inside the black SUV watched him closely. Daniel watched him. Even several reporters turned their cameras in his direction. Angela Brooks remained beside Marcus's casket, her expression unchanged despite the growing tension surrounding her. She had already lost the most important person in her life. Everything else felt distant compared to that pain. Officer Ryan Mitchell noticed the reactions unfolding around him and felt a growing uneasiness settle into his chest. None of this matched the expectations he carried when he arrived. The assignment had seemed straightforward. Yet every passing minute introduced another unexpected complication. Another unfamiliar face. Another unanswered question. The distinguished man stopped near Daniel and exchanged a brief glance. No words were spoken. None seemed necessary. Whatever understanding existed between them was immediate. Ryan stepped forward. "Sir, this area is restricted during an active matter." The man looked at him calmly. "I understand." His voice was measured and professional. Then his attention shifted toward Angela. Respect appeared instantly in his eyes. Ryan noticed it. So did several others standing nearby. The atmosphere around the gravesite felt increasingly strange. Reporters whispered among themselves. Family members clung to one another. The minister stood silently beneath the rain. Marcus's grandmother lowered her eyes and prayed quietly. The little girl still held the white flower she had never been able to place beside the casket. Angela glanced toward the distinguished man before returning her gaze to Marcus's photograph. She seemed neither surprised nor relieved by his arrival. Instead, she looked tired, deeply tired, as though the emotional weight of the past week had finally settled completely onto her shoulders. Ryan checked his watch. Every instinct told him the situation was slipping beyond his control. Yet the instructions he carried remained unchanged. He could not ignore them. Not now. Not after coming this far. He drew a slow breath and looked toward Angela. "Mrs. Brooks," he said carefully, "we need to leave." A murmur swept through the crowd. Marcus's grandmother began to cry openly. One of Marcus's cousins stepped forward in frustration before another family member gently held him back. Daniel Whitaker closed his eyes briefly. The distinguished man looked toward the ground. Even the reporters seemed uncomfortable. Yet Angela simply nodded. The reaction shocked everyone. She did not argue. She did not protest. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she turned slowly toward the casket. Rainwater glistened across the polished wood. Marcus's smiling photograph stood beside a cluster of white flowers. Angela rested her hand gently against the casket and remained there for several silent seconds. The cemetery became completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. It felt as though time itself had paused. Finally, Angela whispered something too soft for anyone else to hear. Then she straightened her shoulders and turned away. The little girl holding the flower began crying quietly. Marcus's grandmother covered her face. The minister lowered his head. The unfinished farewell remained suspended in the cold rain. Angela began walking toward the waiting police vehicles. Ryan followed beside her. Behind them remained a son who had not yet been properly buried. Ahead waited answers no one at the cemetery fully understood. And as Angela stepped into the vehicle, the distinguished man reached for his phone and made a call. The first words he spoke caused Daniel Whitaker's face to tighten with concern. "We are out of time," he said. "They have already taken her." The drive from the cemetery to downtown Columbus passed in near silence. Rain streamed down the windows of the police vehicle, turning the city outside into blurred streaks of gray and gold. Angela Brooks sat quietly in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at the officers. She did not look at the road ahead. Instead, her eyes rested on the small gold watch around her wrist. Marcus had given it to her 3 years earlier on her birthday. She could still remember his smile when she opened the box. "Now you cannot blame being late on the clock anymore," he had joked. The memory arrived so clearly that she almost heard his voice. She closed her eyes and held on to it for a moment. Back at the cemetery, the funeral remained unfinished. The image of Marcus's casket standing alone in the rain refused to leave her mind. Nearly 30 minutes later, the vehicle pulled into the secured parking area behind the police station. News vans were already gathered outside the front entrance. Reporters stood beneath umbrellas speaking into cameras as officers moved through the building. The moment Angela stepped out of the vehicle, dozens of lenses turned toward her. Questions echoed from every direction. Nobody received an answer. Angela simply walked forward with the same calm dignity she had carried through the cemetery. Inside the station, conversations seemed to slow as people noticed her. Officers looked up from their desks. Administrative staff paused in the middle of paperwork. A detective carrying a stack of folders stopped walking entirely. Something about Angela seemed familiar, though few could immediately explain why. Officer Ryan Mitchell noticed the reactions, but pushed them aside. He escorted Angela toward a small interview room near the rear of the building. Upstairs on the third floor, Records Supervisor Harold Benson received a request to verify information connected to the investigation. It was a routine task, one he had performed hundreds of times. Expecting nothing unusual, he logged into the records system and opened the file. Seconds later, his expression changed. Harold leaned closer to the monitor. He blinked. Read the information again. Then a third time. The office around him seemed to disappear. Several classifications appeared at the top of the screen. Federal identifiers, judicial credentials, restricted access notices. Harold frowned. That cannot be right, he whispered. Nearby employees glanced toward him. Harold quickly opened another database. Then another. Every search produced the same result. Every verification matched perfectly. Downstairs, Angela sat alone in the interview room. A narrow window overlooked the rain-soaked parking lot. The ticking wall clock seemed unusually loud. For the first time all day, there were no reporters. No sirens. No cameras. No crowd watching her. Only silence. She rested her hands on the table and stared at the rain sliding down the glass. The quiet gave her room to think about Marcus again. She remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle. She remembered helping him move into his first apartment. She remembered every achievement he celebrated and every disappointment he overcame. A single tear escaped before she gently wiped it away. Upstairs, Harold Benson stared at the screen in disbelief. His hands moved slowly toward the telephone. Whatever he was looking at was far bigger than an ordinary investigation. The implications were impossible to ignore. He dialed a direct internal number and waited. The moment the call connected, he swallowed hard and spoke a sentence that instantly changed the course of the day. "You need to come upstairs immediately," he said. "Someone has made a very serious mistake." Within 20 minutes, the atmosphere inside the police station changed completely. Supervisors who had been casually reviewing paperwork were suddenly moving through hallways with urgency. Office doors opened. Phones rang. Conversations stopped the moment certain names were mentioned. On the third floor, Harold Benson remained seated in front of his computer, staring at information he still struggled to believe. Every database confirmed the same reality. Every credential matched. Every verification returned identical results. There was no error in the records. The error had happened long before the file ever reached his desk. Downstairs, Officer Ryan Mitchell stood outside the interview room reviewing notes when his phone vibrated. He answered immediately. The conversation lasted less than a minute. As he listened, the confidence on his face slowly disappeared. First came confusion, then disbelief. Finally, concern. "That cannot be correct," he said quietly. A pause followed. "Are you absolutely certain?" Another pause. Ryan glanced through the small glass window in the interview room door. Angela Brooks sat alone at the table, staring at the rain outside. She looked exactly as she had looked at the cemetery. Calm, composed, grieving. Yet suddenly Ryan felt as though he were looking at someone entirely different. Upstairs, the precinct chief entered the records office accompanied by two senior administrators. Harold silently turned the monitor toward them. None of them spoke while reviewing the information. The room seemed to grow quieter with every passing second. One administrator removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another stared at the screen in disbelief. The chief finally exhaled and shook his head. How did this happen? Nobody had an answer. Because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Angela Brooks was not simply a citizen connected to an investigation. She was a sitting federal judge. More than that, she was currently overseeing several major federal cases involving public corruption, government accountability, and financial misconduct. Her rulings were studied across multiple jurisdictions. Her name was recognized throughout federal legal circles. Yet somehow she had been removed from her son's funeral and brought to a police station based on information that now appeared deeply flawed. Outside, additional government vehicles arrived. Men and women in dark business attire entered through secured entrances. Staff members watched from hallways as federal representatives moved directly toward administrative offices. Rumors spread quickly through the building. Nobody wanted to say them aloud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Someone had made a catastrophic mistake. Ryan finally opened the interview room door and stepped inside. The wall clock continued ticking softly. Rain continued sliding down the window. Angela looked up. For several moments, neither person spoke. Ryan suddenly found it difficult to maintain eye contact. The certainty that had carried him through the cemetery was gone. In its place stood doubt. Angela noticed it immediately. Something changed, she said quietly. It was not a question. Ryan swallowed, but said nothing. Before he could respond, the door opened again. 3 federal officials entered the room accompanied by Daniel Whitaker. The moment they saw Angela sitting there, their expressions shifted from concern to disbelief. One of the officials stepped forward immediately. "Judge Brooks," he said. The title seemed to freeze the entire room. Ryan felt every muscle in his body tighten. Daniel lowered his eyes. Angela remained seated, her expression unchanged. The federal official continued speaking. "Judge, we sincerely apologize." Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that arrives when assumptions finally collide with reality. And in that moment, Officer Ryan Mitchell realized that the woman he had taken from her son's funeral was not who he believed she was. Worse still, he was beginning to understand that the file he trusted might not have been telling the truth at all. The room remained silent long after the federal official spoke. Rain continued sliding down the window behind Angela Brooks, tracing slow paths through the gray afternoon light. Nobody seemed eager to break the silence. The revelation had changed everything. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood near the door, staring at the floor. The confidence that had guided him throughout the day was gone. In its place was a growing realization that he had never fully understood the situation standing before him. Angela slowly rose from her chair. The federal officials immediately stepped aside, not because of her title, not because of her position, but because of the quiet dignity she carried even now. Daniel Whitaker looked at her with concern. "Judge Brooks, transportation is ready whenever you are." Angela nodded, but remained where she was. Her eyes settled on Ryan. The officer finally looked up. For the first time since arriving at the cemetery, he seemed unsure of what to say. "Judge Brooks," he began. The words felt awkward, formal, inadequate. He stopped. Angela waited patiently. Around them, nobody spoke. Ryan drew a slow breath. "I believed I was doing my job." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I believed the information I was given." Angela listened without interruption. One of the federal officials quietly folded his hands. Daniel remained still beside the doorway. Ryan glanced briefly toward the rain-covered window before continuing. "When I arrived at the cemetery, I saw a file." He swallowed hard. "I saw instructions." His eyes returned to Angela. "I did not see a mother." The admission settled heavily over the room. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Nobody attempted to defend him, because everyone understood the truth hidden inside those words. Angela remained quiet for several moments. Then she spoke softly. "That happens more often than people realize." Ryan lowered his eyes. Earlier that afternoon, he had been certain. Certain about the file. Certain about the urgency. Certain about his authority. Now all of that certainty seemed painfully fragile. Upstairs, investigators had already begun reviewing the records that triggered the entire chain of events. Preliminary findings suggested that multiple entries had been altered before reaching local authorities. Important context had been removed. Critical details had never been forwarded. The information Ryan trusted had not told the full story. Yet none of that mattered most to Angela. Her thoughts remained focused on Marcus. His funeral. His unfinished farewell. She looked toward Daniel. "How much time has passed?" Daniel checked his watch. "Less than 3 hours." Relief briefly crossed Angela's face. The service could still continue. Her son could still be laid to rest properly. Ryan stepped forward slightly. "Judge Brooks." She turned toward him. He struggled to find the right words. Then he finally spoke the simplest truth available. "I am sorry." No excuses followed. No explanations. No attempts to justify what had happened. Just those 2 words. Angela studied him carefully. The room waited. Then she gave a small nod. "Learn from it." Ryan blinked. "Ma'am." Angela glanced toward the rain beyond the glass. "The law matters," she said quietly. "But people matter too." The words settled over the room like a final judgment. Not one delivered from a courtroom bench. one delivered from experience, grief, and wisdom. Daniel lowered his eyes. Even the federal officials seemed affected by the moment. Angela then reached for her coat and moved toward the door. The representatives stepped aside. Ryan remained where he was, watching her leave. For the first time that day, he understood that the greatest mistake had not been trusting the wrong file. The greatest mistake had been forgetting to see the human being standing in front of him. By the time Angela Brooks returned to the cemetery, the storm had almost completely passed. The dark clouds that had dominated the afternoon were drifting slowly toward the horizon, allowing warm streaks of sunlight to break through the sky above the rolling hills. The air smelled of wet grass and fresh earth. Rain still clung to the branches of the oak trees surrounding the cemetery, and small droplets shimmered on rows of polished headstones. The chaos that had interrupted the day was gone. The reporters had disappeared. The flashing lights were gone. The noise had faded. What remained was what should have been there from the beginning. Family. Memory. Farewell. As Angela stepped onto the cemetery path, she saw familiar faces waiting quietly near the gravesite. Marcus's grandmother sat beneath a large umbrella surrounded by relatives. Friends from the community had returned after hearing that the service would continue. Several people who had already left earlier in the afternoon had come back. Nobody wanted Marcus's story to end with confusion. They wanted it to end with love. When they saw Angela approaching, nobody rushed toward her. Nobody asked questions. They simply made room for her to return to where she belonged. The minister stepped forward and removed his hat. "We waited for you," he said softly. Angela nodded. For a moment she could not speak. Her eyes moved toward the casket. It remained exactly where she had left it. Marcus's photograph still rested beside the flowers. The little white flower carried by the young girl had finally been placed beside the frame. The sight nearly brought tears to Angela's eyes. She walked slowly through the wet grass until she reached the casket. Every step felt lighter than the ones she had taken earlier that afternoon. Not because her grief had disappeared. It had not. The loss of Marcus would remain with her forever. But the confusion, humiliation, and interruption that had stolen part of this day no longer stood between them. She rested her hand gently on the polished wood. The evening sunlight touched her face. Around her, the cemetery became perfectly still. The minister reopened his Bible. Family members gathered closer. The service resumed from the exact place where it had been interrupted. This time there were no sirens. No questions. No distractions. One by one, people shared memories of Marcus. A former student spoke about how Marcus had encouraged him during a difficult year. A neighbor remembered Marcus helping repair a broken porch without ever being asked. A childhood friend smiled through tears while recalling summer fishing trips along Lake Erie. Every story painted the same picture. Marcus had lived a life that mattered. Angela listened carefully to each memory. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes tears filled her eyes. Each story felt like a gift. A reminder that while her son was gone, the kindness he left behind remained alive in countless people. As the sun moved lower across the horizon, the service slowly came to an end. Family members approached the grave one final time, placing flowers beside the casket. Eventually, only Angela remained standing there. In her hand rested a single white rose. She looked down at Marcus's photograph and smiled softly. "You made this world better," she whispered. Then she placed the rose beside the casket. A gentle breeze moved through the trees overhead. Golden light spread across the cemetery. In the distance, birds returned to their nests as evening settled across the hillside. Angela stood quietly with her family beside her. There was no anger in her heart, no desire for revenge, only love, only remembrance, only the quiet dignity of a mother who had finally been allowed to say goodbye to her son. And in the silence that followed, the storm was gone, the truth had been revealed, and the final light of day rested peacefully upon Marcus Brooks's grave.